presentation is being viewed okay. So otherwise, because we kind of disappear as we close down our video screens.
I see the recording button on.
I think the live streaming has started. So
Okay, yeah, I saw this my screen changed a bit.
there we
go. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before beginning, we just want to quickly read our land acknowledgement. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huchiyun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders and their ancestors. We are living in a moment that warrants deep reflection on our past and present. As a museum dedicated to advancing knowledge of the archaeology and history of the ancient Levant, the Bade Museum welcomes scholarly discussions across boundaries of nationality, religion, gender, and other aspects of identity. We particularly welcome scholars who are engaging with risky topics in today's fraught political landscape, and whose scholarship bridges past and present through study of issues like migration, borderlands, and social boundaries. Thank you for joining us. And now I'd like to welcome the director of the Bade Museum, Dr. Aaron Brody.
Thanks so much, Jess, for the warm up and the introduction. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce to our internet audience Dr. Anne E. Killebrew, who is professor of classics and ancient Mediterranean studies at Pennsylvania State University, with a specialization in the archaeology of the Levant. She has participated in or directed numerous archaeological projects in Israel, Egypt, and Turkey, and is currently the co-director of the Tel Akko Total Archaeology Project, a project that's near and dear to my heart as well. And that site is a major Canaanite and Phoenician maritime center in northern Israel. She has authored or co-edited 7 books and has published over 100 articles related to the archaeology of the Levant. I'm super thrilled to welcome her to our internet discussion series, and I'm pleased to yield the floor to you, Anne.
Okay.
Looking forward to your talk today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that kind invitation. I'd like to personally thank you for inviting me to participate in your lecture series this year. And I'd also like to thank Jess Johnson, who is also from the Bade Museum of Biblical Archaeology, for her assistance and encouragement. Okay, so I will now start my screen. Whoops, this is the one that I want here. And hopefully all of you see my first slide. Is that correct? Great.
Yes,
Okay,
great.
so we can start then. I'm going to talk today about migration, borderlands, and social boundaries. And I think it's a especially relevant topic today when we're experiencing so much peoples in motion, a lot of movements of peoples all over the world. And from an archaeological point of view, I've always wondered, how can you see these types of really transformative events in the archaeological evidence? So that's really what I'm going to be looking at today, is examining another period of time which was undergoing many transformations. This is the end of the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, from about 1300 to 1100, and look at the archaeological evidence and see if we can discern movements that we know from various biblical and ancient Near Eastern sources. The refugee experience, especially under dire conditions of forced migration, is among the most profound of human experiences. Commemorated in legacy literature, such as the Exodus saga in the Hebrew Bible, it transforms both the immigration and host populations. It is an ordeal that is often deeply rooted in family histories and remains etched over time in a community's shared narrative and memory. Influenced by tragedy, scope, and impact of 21st century forced migrations, renewed examination of the material expressions of involuntary displacement is at the forefront of recent archaeological research. In the archaeological record, identifying similar past movements of displaced peoples, their immigration, journey, and eventual settlement has proved to be especially challenging. Forced departures are often an outcome of violent conflict, destruction, or disaster that result in sudden abandonments or a marked decrease in population. The flight of the dispossessed is materially more ephemeral and difficult to discern in the archaeological record. The settling of significant numbers of displaced peoples is often understood to be expressed in rapid regional population growth, observable in settlement patterns, or the expansion of existing sites, and the appearance of new or intrusive cultural features that suggest a large-scale arrival of new peoples. Movements of smaller numbers of displaced persons or encampments are often more difficult to discern in the archaeological record, although investigations of modern refugee settlements are providing new insights into their impact on the cultural landscape. Recent studies of past migrant populations confirm a material culture that reflects a subsistence-level existence. Massive migrations have been cited among the possible factors responsible for the destruction of sites throughout the Eastern Mediterranean during the final decades of the 13th century BCE, leading to the political and economic breakdown of the Late Bronze Age, a period that I like to characterize as the age of internationalism and the world's first global economy. Conversely, it has been suggested that the demise and decline of the Hittite and New Kingdom Egyptian empires and the accompanying collapse of international trade triggered significant population movements that characterize this period. But what is the material evidence of migration, forced or otherwise, during the 13th and 12th centuries BCE in the southern Levant? In an attempt to answer this question and identify migration in the archaeological record, either as a point of departure or as a destination, in this lecture, I examine the settlement history of 6 key Late Bronze Age sites in the region, exploring 4 questions. And my questions are: what is the Southern Levantine evidence for forced migration departures during the 13th and 12th centuries BCE? What does the archaeological record reveal regarding the arrival and settlement of displaced populations during or following the upheavals of the Late Bronze Age? Third, what role, if any, did migrations, forced or otherwise, play in the collapse of the Late Bronze Age? And lastly, what are the implications regarding the emergence of Israel and the biblical Philistines? Okay, my 6 sites are indicated here on the map. You can see from Tel Dan in the north to Lachish in the south. And the first site I'm going to look at is Hatzor. And what characterizes Hatzor at the end of the Late Bronze Age, or actually a little bit before, the date now is around 1250 BCE, is a destruction followed by a long-term abandonment, perhaps up to a couple centuries. And we do have a biblical verse connected with this site, and it comes from Joshua 11, verse 10, where Joshua describes Hatzor as being destroyed by Joshua, and the site being characterized as the head of all those kingdoms, which would suggest that Hatzor was a very important site. And in fact, archaeological excavations have revealed that this site is the largest Bronze Age site, Late Bronze Age site in the southern Levant. Okay, my second site that I'm going to talk about is also characterized by destruction, but the destruction occurs about 100 years after Hatzor, maybe around 1150 or so. And here also the site experienced a long-term abandonment. So we have 2 sites which are destroyed, one destroyed in the 13th century and one destroyed in the 12th century, where you have it separated for as long as a century. Then my next site I'm going to discuss is Megiddo, which is characterized by destruction also in the 12th century, but it is immediately reoccupied or built on top of the destruction is built, the settlements rebuilt directly on top of the destruction, and you have cultural continuity. My fourth site is Tel Beit Sha'an, which is characterized by destruction. And it should be noted that in the late Bronze Age, Tel Beit Sha'an was also an important Egyptian administrative and military center. So at the site, you have both Canaanite or indigenous cultural features and Egyptian, New Kingdom Egyptian cultural features, such as pottery, buildings, architecture. And this site is destroyed and immediate reoccupation. However, with the destruction, the Egyptian component completely disappears. So it is only indigenous or Canaanite material culture, which continues into the Iron One period. My fifth site is Tel Dan, which is also mentioned in the biblical account. It describes the conquest of Laish, which was the Bronze Age name of Tel Dan, and the settlement of the tribe at Dan at Laish. And the archaeological evidence here indicates destruction and a completely different type of settlement or new population built on top of the destruction. And then my sixth site I'm going to discuss today is Tel Mikne Kron. Tel Ekron or Tel Ekron is mentioned also in the book of Joshua in chapter 13, verses 2 and 3. And it says, "This is the land that still remains, all the regions of the Philistine and those of the Geshurites from Shihor, which is east of Egypt, to the territory of Ekron in the north. All of it counted as Canaanite, though held by 5 Philistine rulers in Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gat, and Ekron." So this site is affiliated with a group that the Bible terms or is known as the Philistines. And in fact, at this particular site, you have a destruction of the it was a very small site during the late Bronze Age, kind of a village. It's destroyed. And then on top of this, you have the continuation of Canaanite material culture. But at one point, all of a sudden, you have a completely new type of material culture with Aegean, or you might say Western or Mycenaean Greek features to it. And this material culture is usually identified with the Philistines. And I think with a high degree of certainty, we can consider this Aegean style material culture, which is very distinctly different from the Canaanite material culture, as representing a completely new population that the Bible identifies as Philistine. So let's look at a little bit more detail at each of these sites and see what we can understand about this period of the end of the late Bronze Age, where you have disruptions and historical sources which mention movements of peoples, etc. So this is Hatzor, and you can see, I'll use my cursor here, my mouse. This is the upper city, and then you have this huge lower area, which is the lower city of Hatzor. And during the Middle and Late Bronze Age, this entire area was occupied. And then later in the Iron Age, only the Acropolis or Upper Tel was occupied. So you can see this biblical description of Hatzor at the head of all these kingdoms does seem to retain a memory of Hatzor's greatness. And as I mentioned, here you have the pattern of destruction sometime in the mid-13th century, and then abandonment. So this is what I described just a moment ago, the upper city, and then the larger lower city. And you can see some of the key late Bronze Age discoveries in the lower city, this stele temple, a gate, infant burials and dwellings, etc. And then on the upper city, you have some monumental palaces or palace temples. There's some debate about the function of these really monumental structures, which date to the Middle Bronze and Late Bronze Age in the upper city of Hatzor. And just to kind of summarize in a chart form what I described, you can see here the late Bronze Age stratigraphy, all the different areas Let me just go back one slide so you can see area C is down here, area H is here. You can see the different areas and what was found in the late Bronze Age. And there's current excavations, renewed excavations that are now going on in the lower city, so it'll be very interesting to see what they find there. And then here's the upper Tell, or the Acropolis. And you have two major structures which have been that date to late Bronze Age, which were found in Area A right here, and Area M, which is on the side of the slope. And here you have the lower city here. So two really massive buildings. You can see the shelter's been built over this structure in Area A. There's some, as I mentioned, some debate about this particular structure. Some people call it a palace, some people call it a temple, some people call it a palace temple. Maybe it served both functions, but there is certainly evidence of cult going on here, and it's also seems to have some sort of administrative function as well. Okay, and here you can just see a detail of the ceremonial palace that we were just looking at. This is the building with the roof over it, with the shelter over it. Then over here on the slope, the area M, this they're calling the administrative palace. And you can see a reconstruction. That's this building right here with this open courtyard and a raised podium, which may be some sort of altar, a large room in the center, which is often interpreted as kind of some sort of reception room, and then a series of smaller rooms around it. As I mentioned, the biblical account describes Hatzor as being destroyed by Joshua. Now, of course, it's hard to attribute who destroyed Hatzor, but there was a very massive destruction. You can see our ceremonial palace here, and this is the wall. This is a detail of that destruction. So you have to imagine when they excavated, all of this area was filled with this massive collapse of burnt mud bricks and beams. It's massive destruction, kind of the mother of all destructions, as the former director, Professor Amnon Ben-Tor, who recently passed away, would describe this as the mother of all destructions. And what's been found on top of this, and throughout, let's put it this way. Initially, it was thought that, let me just go back one slide here. Initially, it was thought that the whole city was destroyed. The whole late Bronze Age city was destroyed in the mid-13th century. However, more recent excavations suggest that it was only the public structures that were destroyed, which has led some archaeologists to interpret this as perhaps some sort of local uprising, and that the elite structures were targeted. So this is open to discussion, debate. I think it's a very interesting idea. So what appears on top of this destruction? As I mentioned, the site was abandoned, and when it was reestablished later in the Iron Age, it was confined to the Acropolis. But on top of this destruction in the area of the ceremonial palace, you have some cultic installations here, which some people have interpreted as some sort of memorial, perhaps to the memory of Hatzor. It's unclear. Standing stones and little miniature standing stones. It's a really interesting archaeological discovery. The fact that these standing stones were discovered, that's the facts. And then you can come up with all sorts of different interpretations. And this is the fun part of archaeology, is kind of using your imagination to interpret what the actual archaeological remains mean. Okay, moving on to Lachish in the southern part of Israel. This is another site that was a very important settlement in the late Bronze Age, also with an Egyptian presence or influence at this particular site. It also was destroyed, but about 100 years after Hatzor. And this ended the Egyptian presence. And then you have the site, once like Hatzor, being abandoned for some time, a century or so. So two sites that were very important late Bronze Age sites, both of them destroyed, but at different times, and then abandoned for some period of time. So the question is, well, where did all the people from Hatzor go? Because it was a pretty big settlement. And where did all the people of Lachish go? Because this site, well, at least up until now, archaeological excavations have not revealed any immediate settlement after the destruction. And here you can see the a chart form of what I was describing, this occupation during the late Bronze Age, and then around 1130 or so, destruction by fire of stratum 6, and then a gap of maybe up to 200 years, and then the site is resettled in the Iron II period. The 9th century is usually when it's dated to, and it becomes associated with the Kingdom of Judea, the southern kingdom. Okay, just to show you a little bit of what the late Bronze Age stratum 6, the early 12th century looked like at Hatzor, at Lachish. In recent excavations of about a decade or so ago, a very interesting temple was found, and it had very clear Egyptian, kind of a mixture of Egyptian and Canaanite features to it. You have Egyptian style column bases, some architectural features. But also mixed together with this, you also have clear Canaanite material culture. So this kind of what's it called? You can call Egypto-Canaanite temple. Who knows what kind of worship was going on there? And in the destruction here, you also, in another area, you also find people who were caught in the destruction. Okay, you also have a monumental public building that dates to the 12th century. You can see a plan of this building. It's in here, you can see a photo. So it is a fairly impressive structure with a row of pillars in it. This is the burial I was just talking about. This is typical depiction of usually a Canaanite woman, usually associated with Canaanite deity, maybe Asherah or Astarte. Then you have Egyptian scarab here. So once again, this mixture of Egyptian and Canaanite features. And all of this was destroyed, abandoned for approximately 200 years. Also at Lachish, which would indicate Egyptian presence, you find these anthropoid coffins, which appear at a number of Canaanite sites where there's clear evidence there was an Egyptian presence, probably an administrative or perhaps also military presence, and you find these clay coffins that are that have an Egyptian, I would say, influence, or they are Egyptian in origin, or the idea is Egyptian. And you find these at Lachish, you find these at Bet She'an, which I'll talk about in a moment. You find these at Deir el-Balach, Tel el-Farah South. So you have various different sites where we know Egyptians were there in the 13th century, where you find these coffins. And here's an Egyptian style bowl with hieratic inscription on it. Now Megiddo, we have a different picture. This is also in the north, but south of Hatzor, as you remember from the map, and it is on the Jezreel plain, on the western edge of the Jezreel plain. So we have Hatzor, which is in the Upper Galilee. We have Lachish, which is in the Shephelah, the kind of low rolling hills of Judea. And then we have Megiddo in the fringe, on the western fringe of the Jezreel Valley. Here we have a late Bronze Age Canaanite citadel. No real evidence of Egyptian presence, though there certainly are Egyptian artifacts that are found in the late Bronze Age layers. But here you have a destruction, also around 1130. And then immediately the site is rebuilt and you have continuation of Canaanite culture. So even though you have a destruction, it seems like the same people continued to live there. And here we have just kind of a summary of the different areas of Megiddo, what was found there. Late Bronze Age 3, which would be 12th century. Early Iron Age would be, late Bronze Age 3 would be 12th century. First half, early Iron 1, which would be the second half of the 12th century. And then Iron 1, which gets into the 11th century. And during the late Bronze Age, you have this lovely palace. However, if you go to Megiddo today, except for a few of the foundations, you will not see any evidence of it because it was removed so that the excavators, this was excavated by the University of Chicago in the 1930s, so that the excavators were able to excavate what was under it. Of course, when you're an archaeologist, you're always debating what should we leave, what should we remove, because if you want to know what's underneath it, you have to destroy it. So all we have of this particular late Bronze Age palace are these lovely black and white photos. It's very impressive, as you can see. And then you have evidence of this massive destruction in one of the rooms of the palace I just showed you. One of the rooms was nicknamed the Treasury because a lot of really lovely artifacts were found in there, including ivories. And you can see here the pottery assemblages of stratum 7A and stratum 6. And you can see this continuity between the pre-destroyed late Bronze Age settlement and then the continuation of occupation at the site in the later 12th and 11th centuries. So it's just a direct continuation of the same cultural features or cultural influences. Okay, the fourth site I want to bring as an example of the topic that I'm addressing, migration and population movements, forced migrations in particular, is Bet She'an, which, as I mentioned, is a late Bronze Age Egyptian Canaanite stronghold. And here you have the partial destruction of the site, expulsion of the Egyptians. And we can see this because in the layer on top of the 12th century settlement, there's no Egyptian artifacts or Egyptian style artifacts, and a continuation of Canaanite culture. Now, Bet She'an, as you remember in the map, is on the eastern edge of the Jezreel Valley. So what we see in the Jezreel Valley is a clear continuity between the late Bronze Age and Iron Age, a clear continuity of the indigenous Canaanite culture. While in the south, we have destruction and abandonment at Lachish. In the north, at Hatzor, we also have destruction and abandonment. And here you can see the level 6 late Bronze Age Egyptian Canaanite remains. Here is what's called the administrative building, and it has clear Egyptian architectural features. This is, if you visit the site today, this particular building has been restored, and you can see these huge limestone columns. These are typical of Egyptian architecture. The brick sizes are typical of Egyptian brick sizes. And of course, we have about 25% of the pottery at Tel Bet She'an during this period is locally made Egyptian style pottery. Here's a detail. You can see how massive these columns are. You can see here the mud brick architecture, the threshold, which is also Egyptian in style. And here you can see the pottery, approximately 20 to 25% of the pottery is Egyptian in style. And if you look at it, and I dug at Bet She'an, I dug at Megiddo, both those sites. If you look at the pottery here, if you're an Egyptian archaeologist, you say, oh, this is Egyptian pottery. But when we checked the clay of these vessels, it was shown to be locally made. So my interpretation of this is when the Egyptian administrators came to the site, they brought with them kind of an entourage of Egyptians that helped them live an Egyptian style life. And this included creating very ordinary everyday pottery in the Egyptian style so that they could continue to probably like the American forces abroad. They bring in a lot of American style food and culture. And at Tel Lachish, at Tel Bet She'an, as at Tel Lachish, you also the earlier expeditions by the University of Pennsylvania between the two world wars also found these anthropoid coffins, which indicate Egyptians were at the site. Okay, then we have level 5, which is built directly on top of the destroyed remains, and this continues the late Bronze Age Canaanite culture. The only thing that's different about it is there's no Egyptians. Okay, the fifth site that I'd like to talk about as a case study to examine our idea of how does migration look in the archaeological evidence is the site of Tel Dan, which is in the far north, right along the Lebanese and Syrian border today of Israel. And here you have a late Bronze Age Canaanite settlement, and it seems to have been destroyed. And here we do have evidence of a new population group arriving, bringing with them a different type of material culture. Now, this occurred probably around 1200 or early 12th century. And you can see the different excavation areas. There are renewed excavations at the site. I believe they're digging this coming summer, if I'm not mistaken, if they can. I saw some advertisements for their excavations, and you can see all those red dots are pits. And what you have dug into the remains of the late Bronze Age settlement are these huge pits. You don't really have too much architecture, but you do have a lot of pits, and inside these pits is a very distinctive type of pottery, mainly very utilitarian types of pottery, large storage jars, cooking pots, and jugs. You can see here a plan of these pits that kind of cut through the late Bronze Age. These pits here, these circles here, just the black circles are the pits. You can see examples of these pits. Here's one in section, cutting through the earlier late Bronze Age remains. And this is the late Bronze Age pottery assemblage. You can see there's a great variety of vessels. Some of them are decorated. You have imported vessels. This, for example, is imported from Cyprus. It's a white shaved juglet. And then in these pits, you have a completely different assemblage. You have these huge storage containers, which are called pithoi, and you have big craters, kind of serving vessels, and cooking pots. So it's undecorated, it's very limited in the types of vessels, and it's very utilitarian and only pits. As I said, there's not really a lot of architecture that's associated with this besides the pits. So it seems like something completely new is occurring at Tel Dan now. Whether you want to associate them with the tribe of Dan, we don't know who dug these pits, but that is the biblical tradition associated with this site. Okay, the last example that I'd like to bring to you is the site of Ekron, which is located in the southern coastal plain, just kind of east of Ashdod and south, a little bit south of Tel Aviv. And you can see it's a large site, at least during some periods of time. This is the size of the site here during sub-periods. Middle Bronze Age, which were the first half, the second millennium, the entire site is occupied. And then in the late Bronze Age, the period that we're interested in, you have only occupation in this small acropolis, which is the highest part of the mound. And you can see a lot of excavations have gone on here, as well as in the center and in the southern part and the western part. And then during the Iron One, early, let's say mid 12th century, the entire site is occupied again. So this one is quite different because here I do think you have even a clear-cut separation between the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age than you had at Dan. Because at this particular site, you have the appearance of a completely different style of material culture that has no connections at all to the late Bronze Age traditions. So this is what I just described. The Canaanite village, a late Bronze Age village, about 5 acres, tiny. And then you have in the 12th century, second half of the 12th century, the entire site is occupied, and you find this new type of material culture. Okay, so this is on the Acropolis in the northeast corner of the site where we have the white circle. And this is a deep trench or sondage that we excavated. This actually I excavated in the 1980s, a long time ago. But here you have the entire stratigraphic sequence. So down here at the bottom, and some of you may have heard that boom. That's supposed to signify destruction. We have stratum 9, which was destroyed, keeping in mind this is a small settlement, probably a village, more like a village than anything else. We have, even though it's a village, you have the entire assemblage of late Bronze Age pottery, including imported vessels from the Greek world, from the Cypriot world, few from Egypt, whole repertoire of Canaanite pottery. On top of this destruction, which I would date to around 1200, you have between these two arrows series of stratified remains. You can see all these black lines here. Each one of these represents a floor or surface. So on top of the destroyed late Bronze Age village, you have this kind of really ephemeral resettlement of the site, still in the Canaanite tradition. And on these black surfaces, we found a lot of evidence of recycling of metals, which is very characteristic of the end of the late Bronze Age, which perhaps would indicate the collapse of the trade in metals and people really trying to recycle whatever they had. All of this is in the late Bronze Age tradition, including this wall here, okay? And then on top of that, whoops, it's a little bit overly enthusiastic. We have stratum 7, which I would date till around 1160 to the late 12th century. And here is where we have the appearance of this completely new material culture in every way, in pottery, in architecture, in cult, in technology. And at this time, Ekron becomes a fortified urban center. So this new city, one of the first things they did was build a city wall around the entire huge tell as far as we can see. And there's apparently a massive population. However, these people are hardly refugees. The Tel Dan, you get the sense that this is a very poor community that settled on top of the ruins of Tel Dan, while at Ekron, you have this sudden appearance of this new material culture. No signs of destruction between stratum 8 and stratum 7. And so it seems like these new people kind of came and just took control over this site. Okay, so this is characterized by kind of what's called Mycenaean 3C pottery, indicating I would say its influence from the Greek world, but probably where the influence is more closely tied to Cyprus. And then we have on top of that, late 12th and early 11th centuries, combination of Mycenaean 3C and bichrome, which is a type of pottery which has two colors on it, which develops out of Mycenaean 3C pottery. I'm going to be showing you some examples of this in a moment, but I wanted to show you the stratigraphy, describe to the stratigraphy. And then on top of that, we have the 11th century, stratum 5, which is only Philistine bichrome. So the Mycenaean 3C, which is pottery painted in one color, disappears. And so by the time we have here a span of a little over 200 years, but you can see how well stratified this site is. And we're talking here maybe about an accumulation of 4 meters, 5 meters over this period of time. This person standing here is about 6 feet tall. So that gives you kind of an idea of scale. So a really excellent stratigraphic sequence regarding this transition from the late Bronze Age into the Iron One, and probably one of the best examples, at least that I've ever seen, of the arrival on a large scale of a new population, clearly not destitute, with the ability, who came, in my opinion, very intentionally to build an urban center. Okay, so let's look at some of the details. So just to convince you of what I'm trying to say, late Bronze Age, late Bronze to local Canaanite pottery, you can see on the upper part of your screen here. Typical Canaanite storage jar here, Canaanite bowls, Canaanite household storage jar decorated with an ibex, imported pottery from Cyprus, imported pottery from Greece. So even though it's kind of not a very important place, still the imports are reaching this. These are figs, and this is actually from the 13th century destruction, and the figs were carbonized in the storage jar. And if you go to the Israel Museum today, you can see this jar on display. And then following the destruction, we have a continuation, as I mentioned, of late Bronze Age Canaanite traditions. And then around sometime in the first half of the 12th century, this appearance of new material culture. And if you look at this and you compare it to what's above it, you can see there's absolutely no similarities. There's no similarities in the shape of the pottery, in the decoration of the pottery. The technology of the pottery is completely different. These are all wheel-made vessels. These are coil and handmade vessels largely. So a break in every possible way you could imagine. The kiln, we analyzed this Aegean style pottery, Mycenaean 3C and the bichrome. And this is a kiln that produced the Mycenaean 3C pottery. It's a square kiln, very unusual in shape. There's no real parallels to this in the Canaanite world. It was fired at a very low temperature. We did a lot of analyses of the firing temperatures. It was probably around 550, 600 degrees, while late Bronze Age Canaanite pottery were fired in kilns at about 750, 800 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's reasons why. And then you can see the kind of we're talking about thousands of sherds like this. We're not talking about a handful, we're talking about all over every area that was excavated at Ekron. And here you have something which is quite different from the Canaanite tradition, and that is the cooking pots. And just to compare between the two, the Philistine cooking pot and the late Bronze Age cooking pot, which completely different shape, probably completely different cuisine. And what our analysis discovered was of the bones, the animal bones, is together with this new material culture, we have a huge increase in pig bones, reaching up to 20% of the assemblage. So once again, material culture, diet, cult. And this slide here kind of summarizes all the different components of this new material culture, which differs from Canaanite. We have new types of figurines, which are completely different than what you saw from Lachish, a different concept. Perhaps this is a goddess. Hearths, which are unknown in the Canaanite culture. Incised scapulae, cow scapulae, which are at several different Philistine sites. Some people think this is a musical instrument. Some people think this is something used for divination. And then, of course, the ceramics. And lastly, something I'm just going to add at the end, which differs from what you'll read in a lot of textbooks. If you look at the Egyptian Ramses III temple at Medinet Habu, which describes his famous battle between various groups associated with the Sea Peoples, including the Philistines. This is the earliest extra-biblical mention of the Philistines. You can see the only depiction of a Philistine which is labeled as a Philistine, chief of the Philistines, and you can see he has a beard and he has a cap and he doesn't look at all Aegean. So it is my opinion, my theory, that the Philistines are actually not from the Aegean world. They're from more the Levantine world, probably Cyprus, in my opinion. Okay, so let's summarize here. A heterogeneous picture emerges from this analysis of the relevant 13th and 11th century BCE strata from 6 key southern Levantine sites, illustrating the complexity of reactions to the collapse of international trade and imperial control that resulted in movements of people. At sites located in the fertile valleys and along major routes such as Megiddo and Tel Bet-She'an, the indigenous Canaanite culture displays resiliency and even thrives following the collapse of the Late Bronze Age. At Hatzor and Lachish, in the north and the south, inland settlements located adjacent to or in the highland regions experienced greater devastation and sudden depopulation. The disappearance of their large populations likely represents involuntary departure and forced migration of their inhabitants. The archaeological evidence suggests that those fleeing from these destructions may have resettled in the vicinity, likely perhaps in small highland villages. And one of the features of this period is the appearance of small villages in the highland regions, south of Hatzor and north of Lachish. Likely in small highland villages, such as Hatzor being abandoned, and the New Galilee villages, which appear at this time or during the 12th and 11th centuries, or possibly relocated, perhaps unwillingly, to nearby towns. For example, the abandoned Lachish and the rapid growth and expansion of Philistine settlements, especially at Tel Mikne-Ekron. Dan, in the far north, experienced the incursion of new populations. In some cases, such as Dan, the Late Bronze Age was apparently destroyed, followed by the arrival of a migrating group who brought with them a subsistence-level material culture. The dramatic change in Dan's fortunes during the 12th century BCE may represent the arrival of a refugee population, a scenario that is possibly reflected in the biblical tradition of the settlement of the tribe of Dan. This also corresponds with the dramatic shift in settlement patterns during the Iron One, characterized by the appearance of small villages in the hill country regions of the Galilee and the Central Hill Country. The sudden appearance of these villages provides additional evidence for a refugee population displacement possibly associated with the emergence of early Israel. And lastly, an external material culture, and here we're talking about Tel Mikne-Ekron, Aegean in style and distinctly different in all aspects from Levantine traditions, also appears during the 12th century BCE at several sites associated with the Philistines in the southern coastal plain. The best documented of these settlements is Tel Mikne-Ekron. Devastated by late 13th century destruction, its indigenous inhabitants returned to reestablish a village on top of the ruins. This modest settlement is replaced without any signs of destruction by a large urban and walled city, featuring a completely different material culture that expands tenfold in size over a short period of time. In this case, the newcomers to Tel Mikne-Ekron are not refugees fleeing disaster, rather a well-organized group with clear colonizing intentions who likely integrated the indigenous population in their well-planned and rapidly growing town. Thank you very much, and I welcome questions.
And thank you so much. Do you mind actually stopping sharing my screen?
Okay, let me get this here. Let me find this here. Escape. Oh, there we go.
And we have a number of questions from our internet audience that I'd like to.
Okay, great. Excellent.
Jess's help. And I'll just sort of go in order. First of all, I want to thank you for a really fascinating lecture. And I think, it does a great job of describing to our audience how a one-size-fits-all approach really doesn't work, even in a relatively small geographic area. And so I'll just leave it at that, but I'll go to some questions here. Um, the first one is, how were you inspired in your project by the modern investigation of refugees and migration patterns?
I I think that we as archaeologists, first of all, we're always influenced by our culture and what's historically happening in our world. And you just see these massive movements of people over the last couple decades. First of all, your heart breaks in many cases because it's really difficult to be a migrant person. And then you begin to think, well, this happened in the past. How can we, what physical evidence would you have of this? Or let's say if somebody's excavating the United States, 1,000 years from now, would they be able, and let's say they had no historical sources, would they be able to see these new population groups, which I think in particular in California has had a strong impact, certainly, Texas, California. I mean, these migrant populations have really impacted these places. So how would they be different from people who've been living in California or Texas for, say, generations? So it's very intrigued. Yeah, I'm very intrigued by these questions of migration and how it impacted the past and what was the result. And I think when you look at the late Bronze Age and you look at this global society, global in the terms of the second millennium BC, uh, and how fragile it was, and what happened when this all came collapsing down. And of course, I think many of us kind of look at today and go, oh my gosh, are we kind of stage of collapsing? And you wonder, well, what happened in the past? And I guess my takeaway from all of this, and this is an aspect of this I didn't touch upon in this particular lecture, is there's winners and losers.
Sure.
And so the losers are the elites, the empires, the Hittite Empire, New Kingdom Egypt, the elite of the society, the people who lived in the palace of Hatzor. These are the losers, but there's winners too. And the winners here are, well, definitely the Philistines. And I'm just calling them the Philistines because it's good to have a label for an archaeological phenomenon. And we do have Egyptian and biblical sources which talk about these people. And there's no reason not to associate them, particularly since these sites are specifically mentioned as Philistine sites. And the Phoenicians, which are coastal people in the central and into the northern Levant, basically what's northern Israel and Lebanon today. And these communities thrived. Apparently the Canaanite communities or the indigenous communities of the Jezreel Valley continued. So you do have winners. So all of this really intrigued me. I've been fascinated by this period of time for a few decades, and I think it really ties in to what we're experiencing today. And I guess it gives me hope in a way. Because definitely it's kind of, I call it a transformation more than a collapse. It's society transforming or being forced to transform.
Sure. And I'm just thinking back to, what a nuanced presentation you gave today compared to older thinking about these transitions,
Right.
where it was sort of unicausal. Everything was blamed on the sea peoples.
Right.
Any lens related to destruction, from Cilicia, where you've worked, down to Egypt, I guess, was, and so, both in terms of the, what am I trying to say? The, the hugeness, I mean, because even beyond the region of, the southern Levant, these kinds of impacts were being felt, but it's not, none of this is unicausal, right? And it also happens over, as you've demonstrated, several hundred years. So it's not just a sort of instantaneous, kind of cause and effect.
Right.
Something that, transpired over time, and was quite diverse in terms of its impacts in the varied regions, of the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks. Yeah.
Again, thinking, back, and of course, a lot of, sort of older thought has gone out of vogue, but perhaps, younger students won't realize that. Okay, I should go on to more questions. I think these are perhaps more specific to
Okay.
varied archaeological arguments that you made today. But could you speak more about what a local uprising, like has been suggested at Hatzor, might have looked like in the archaeological record?
Okay, this is a really interesting question because Sharon Zuckerman, who was one of the excavators of Hatzor, really pioneered this idea before her untimely death a decade or so ago from cancer. And she believed that the evidence, first of all, that only the elite buildings seem to have been destroyed. And then inside some of these structures, you have what seemed to be the intentional destruction of cultic objects, such as statues of seated
Mhm.
men who either is a deity or perhaps the king, and they seem to have been intentionally destroyed. So because of its localized destruction, and I believe the new excavations are confirming this. I'd have to check and see the last season or two what they've discovered, and this apparent intentional destruction of symbolic objects led her to this theory that Hatzor was destroyed by a peasant, like local peasants uprising. Of course, one of the theories regarding the origins of early Israel is that it's an indigenous Canaanite oppressed class that rose up against the elite. And this is actually one of the origins of early Israel. And I think it's an interesting idea and has some support in the archaeological evidence.
Thank you for those clarifications. Okay, moving along. Let's see. You mentioned at Bet Shan that there was an expulsion of Egyptian presence because the upper archaeological layer doesn't contain any Egyptian artifacts. Are there any other signs that would suggest expulsion?
I think it's mainly, well, once again, their buildings, the residency that I showed you on in the PowerPoint, that was destroyed. And it wasn't as if after the destruction there was some village on top of it. No, you do have some impressive buildings that are being constructed on top of the destruction. There's absolutely no Egyptian pottery, no Egyptian features to any of the architecture. And this seems pretty much throughout Canaan at all of the sites where where we either have documentary evidence of the Egyptian presence or archaeological evidence. By the mid 12th century, the Egyptian artifacts completely disappear and Egypt retreats. I mean, Canaan, it wasn't really a colony of Egypt, but it was really under Egyptian taxation and control. And of course, one of the main exports from Canaan were slaves. So this whole story of the Exodus does tie into the environment of Canaan during the late Bronze Age and New Kingdom Egypt, where you have this either through conquest or through trade, Canaanite Semitic slaves going to Egypt. So if they just did all this Egyptian evidence and New Kingdom Egypt goes into period of decline, doesn't collapse like the Hittite Empire does, but it goes into this period of decline and retreat, and it was no longer capable of taxing and controlling Canaan,
Right, maintaining an empire.
maintaining it exactly.
Yeah, I'm just think these sort of ideas about expulsion, that's tough to demonstrate,
Yeah.
archaeologically, but I think as you've touched on, sort of looking at the bigger picture, so not just one site, but that punctuated presence that you've written about so nicely in the past of, of actual Egyptians at very particular sites in the southern Levant, that shows no continuity. Um, but it's, again, you can't attribute it to sort of one event. It could have been just over time. So thank you. One last question. I just want to be mindful of time. So we'll end with this one. At Ekron, could you talk more about why the newer settlers weren't characterized as refugees? Was it the lack of struggle or destruction in the archaeological record, or the evidence of what appeared to be a more rich and newer cultural tradition?
Yeah, I think at Akron, once again, in the late Bronze Age, it was a pretty miserable little place. It was 5 acres in size, confined to that kind of high part of the tell. No fortifications, and what you get when you have the appearance of the new material culture is the first thing they do is they build this massive mud brick city wall, and it's found in my excavation area. It's also found in the excavation area to the south. So it seems like it was encompassing at least the areas we excavated, which is, from the north to the south, a really large area. You also have buildings that are immediately in the center of the tell, these what the excavators they're called elite structures, these very impressive villas, almost like villas, massive, I mean, dwarfing anything that was there in the late Bronze Age. Very developed. You have industry set up. We have the pottery kilns. We have this pottery. I showed you one kiln, but we excavated other kilns as well. So we have this whole potter's quarter that are next to the fortification system. And it's just a very well developed, full blown culture. It seems like they built the city walls, they built impressive buildings, they immediately set up pottery production. It all seemed like a subsistence style level. So it seems like these people knew what they were doing. Maybe with the retreat of the Egyptians over time, they sensed an opportunity to set up a colony. I mean, I consider them colonizers, and I believe that they came from Cyprus. I mean, it's also once again a complex process. If you look at the other sites that are associated with the Philistines, each one of these has a somewhat different development, and I think people's perhaps coming from different regions of the Eastern Aegean, Cyprus, not so much the Western Aegean. But each one of these has a somewhat, as I showed, even with these sites that I discussed from the north to the south, you have to really examine these on their individual level because each one of them has a different story. So just because of the massiveness, it wasn't something that developed slowly over time. It was like boom.
Right.
Grown.
It's so fascinating too that the sort of the final LB levels at Ekron show no sign of at least destruction by fire, right? I mean,
Right.
And if I'm remembering, although I was part of the Ashkelon
Right.
excavation team back in the day in the 80s and 90s. And it was, I believe, a similar set of evidence there as well. So, which countered again, an earlier generation of narrative where, um, Sea People's raiders would come in and level, existing settlements, and, these sort of warrior peoples were all over the Eastern Mediterranean, wreaking destruction. And
Exactly.
it doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but it's fascinating that even among the Philistine Pentapolis, that one can't, sort of paint each of those 5 sites with the same brush, right? You really have to look at them individually and consider the variety of evidence.
Right.
And I also really appreciate, and I think it's important for the audience to hear, that one way to actually propose that there are migrations is to really look at the assemblage of archaeological materials, or even more recently, things like the kinds of plants that were being brought by these um, new settlers are different than so their dietary, the things that they were eating, the ways that you were cooking, which you described so nicely, are different. But it's not, again, just if you just looked at the pottery, it might give you sort of certain kinds of answers. But when you look at holistically the architectural forms, those hearths that you showed, et cetera, et cetera. It really, one can envision a kind of transplantation of some sort of Aegeanized material culture to an area where it had only known contact through economic forms, through trade and that sort of thing. And again, I'm sorry, I'm sort of hogging the screen time here, and I do want to wrap things up for time, but the picture in the northern part of the southern Levant, so in the Akko Plain and the Jezreel Valley, is so different than it is in this area that becomes known as Philistia,
Right.
the southern coastal plain. So,
Right.
well, I'll end on that note. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. This was a lot of fun. And I welcome if anybody wants to contact me via email. I'm happy to answer any other questions people may have.
And fantastic. And so nice to see also. I know you've had direct experience at so many of those sites that you described today. So a real example of how your hands-on knowledge can impact the kinds of research questions, but then also research output that you've been working on now for a good part of your career.
Years.
For sharing her research. The next talk in this series is on January 30th at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Dr. Marvin Weiser, who will be sharing a talk titled Their Servitude I Loosened, a Reexamination of Persian Period Judean Remigration in Light of the U.S. Bracero and Border Industrialization Programs. We look forward to seeing you then.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was fun. I enjoyed it. I usually don't like so much talking on Zoom, but
Oh,
somehow I felt a little bit, maybe because it was you and you're my friend, I felt a little bit like connected.
it went great, and again, it'll take a little while to get it actually
That's
posted.
And I'll send you, if you don't get my script at the beginning and the end soon, just send me a reminder, okay? And I'm happy to right here.
Will do. And one of the folks watching, I don't know if you remember, but Anna Choi, who dug with me at Ashkelon, watched and sent her hellos. I couldn't.
Oh, how
It
nice.
wasn't really a question, but she was also a friend of
that's so
Eddie's
nice. Yeah, that's so nice. Yeah, that's great.
as well. So she.
Okay, and thanks to everybody for your assistance. And I'm glad I waited to do it now.
Thank you. Yes, and also thank you for your patience.
Oh, that was no problem.
Came off without any hitches today. So
yay.
Yeah, well, except for I cut off Jess's outro. So
well, maybe could that be added in from the locally, from the local recording? If not, it's not.
Possibly. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's going to be offline probably till the next talk anyway.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Anyway,
I was timing it perfectly, and then I went too fast.
Of all the things, that's very, very, very minor. So, Anne, any further news about your possible return to the?
Yes, well, I am leaving tomorrow for Switzerland. So
okay.
it looks like I'm going to be approved for travel at the end of the month.
Okay.
So I'm just waiting for the final document, but I've already bought my ticket. I'm leaving on January 31st.
Okay.
Where in Switzerland are you traveling?
I'm going to Israel. So I was supposed to be there in September 1st, but Penn State, and I understand why they said, no, you can't go there. So yeah, I've been
back from over a year.
I have to admit though, I got a leave of absence from Penn State for the year. And it was nice having this last semester off.
Sure.
Yeah.
So where in Switzerland will you be?
Pardon?
Where in Switzerland?
Bern. We have a conference on, I'm talking about something I did many years ago. Jewish ossuaries from the Second Temple period, and a site that I excavated also in the 90s, Katsyun, it's about Jewish Roman interactions. So I was invited. I was very surprised. I mean, Jody Magnus is going to be there, and Steve Fine, and then I got this invitation because I haven't worked on this stuff in maybe 3 decades. So I was kind of like, wow, okay. So I'm working on that PowerPoint today, trying to get that finished up.
Nice.
Should be fun. And then I come back for like 10 days and I leave for Israel. And we'll see. I mean,
Okay.
we live in a crazy world. That's
Yeah.
insane world. That's all I can say. But
Yeah, very true.
Jess, where were you in Switzerland?
I was in Basel actually, but I made many day trips to Bern.
oh, what would you recommend seeing there?
In Bern?
Yeah.
Oh,
What
they have a really famous fondue restaurant. It's actually, I think,
oh,
one of the oldest ones. If I can find the name of it, I'll send it to you. And
okay, great. I love fondue. Yeah.
yeah, and maybe if you've ever been there, they have an open park, sort of zoo where you can walk through and see like bears.
Oh, no, I've never
'Cause
been to Bern. This is my
oh
first.
yeah, it's like an open park zoo where you can like see bears foraging around, and it's kind of like right in the center of the city. It's kind of wild, but it's really fun.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That sounds really nice. Yeah, I'm excited. So, yeah, so this date actually worked out really well for me because if I'd done it when I was traveling, I would have had this, here I have my big, camera and my nice office. And when I'm traveling, I'm kind of hunched over my, those,
Sure.
it's just my face kind of blown up. So it worked out well.
Yeah.
Okay, take care. And I will,
You-
thanks
you.
again to all of you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And thanks, Nico.